Hello Internet, says Skorkowski, and today we'll be taking a ride on the Call of Cthulhu Gaslight-era adventure Nightmare on the Necropolis Express. Written by Glynn Owen Barrass and published by Stygian Fox in 2019. The scenario is short, just 38 digest-sized pages, and is available in this adorable, teeny little hardback. I was at Chaosium Con a few years back, and I saw their collection of their small Cthulhu by Gaslight hardbacks, and I was all, yeah, I'm buying all of these. The adventure is for 7th edition Cthulhu by Gaslight and written to be used with Stygian Fox's Hudson and Brand Inquiry Agents of the Obscure supplement, but it's not required that you use Hudson and Brand for it. I should probably get around to doing my review for Hudson and Brand because this has been the basis for our entire Cthulhu by Gaslight campaign. I should also get around to reviewing Cthulhu by Gaslight sometime, but today is not that day. The adventure is designed for 2 to 4 characters and is playable in just 4 to 5 hours. It involves the London Necropolis Company, who was formed during the 1850s burial crisis to build and provide rail transportation to a much larger cemetery outside the city, as well as exhume and move many of the old existing cemeteries. Now, while the module does a good job of incorporating this very real and weird piece of London history, the adventure itself is extremely simple and has a few problem areas that game masters should smooth out or just beef up a little. You gonna mention all those railroad bots? Because most of the adventure takes place on a train. Well, not anymore. Thanks for stealing my joke. Anywho, that's what we're going to talk about today. My praises, my criticisms, and suggestions on how to fix them as a game master who has successfully run this adventure. Hey, and I'm Jack the NPC. I made to give it to you from a player's side of things, as I get to poke at dead things and try to avoid them poking me back. But before we go any further, I must warn you that there will be spoilers, so any players in the audience, please stop here. But send your game masters this way to learn about running this adventure for you. But if you keep going and you spoil yourself, you'll be kicked off a moving train. Okay, Game Masters, let's dig in. But first, the backstory. With the population explosion of the 19th century, London was not only running out of places to bury their dead, but disease from all the rotting corpses that were piling up was becoming pretty horrific. So the London Necropolis Company was formed to construct and maintain this huge Brookwood cemetery 23 miles outside the city. Remains were exhumed from London's overcrowded churchyard, and cemeteries and charnel pits were then moved to this new site. A dedicated railway was constructed to carry the dead and the mourners to the cemetery, and in proper British classism, both the living and the dead could travel by first, second, or third class. Now, that is the real history, or at least all you need to know summary for this adventure that we're going to play. Now, while the London burial crisis was pretty much over by the 1890s, a recent discovery in one corner of the West Norwood Cemetery discovered a previously forgotten cemetery that was going back all the way to medieval times. So the London Necropolis Company was tasked with excavating and moving all of these unmarked graves. Now, among those graves was a 16th century sorcerer named Sir Edward Cockayne. Now, while exhuming the bodies, a laborer named Young Barry stole Sir Edward's gold amulet, and he ended up stashing this treasure in the train's first-class cabin. Enraged at being awoken from his slumber and the theft of this artifact, Sir Edward's spirit now haunts the train, gathering power and intent on recovering his property and enacting revenge on the thieves that stole it. The adventure opens with the investigators being contacted by Tommy Thompson, a conductor for the London Necropolis Company. Tommy tells them of the exhumed West Norwood Cemetery, and every night after midnight, as they're transporting the remains to Brookwood Cemetery, the men have reported strange feelings like an evil presence, including seeing red glowing eyes in the darkness. Now, the men, of course, are all freaked out by this and have pooled their money to hire the investigators to see if they can stop this or kind of solve what's going on here. All that they ask is that the characters ride with them on tomorrow night's train. Well, let me get this straight now. You want to pay me just to ride with you on a train for a single night? Huh. That sounds like easy money to me. You got yourself a deal, boss. While his dialogue box says it's just to ride with them for one night, I'd have Tommy explain during any back and forth roleplay that he's really wanting them to join them until they can give assurance that this entity is gone. So yes, he wants the PCs to ride with them tomorrow night, but the actual job is to get rid of the spirit or whatever it is, because he and his men are freaked out. They're having a lot of trouble getting men to work this late shift trying to take everything to the Necropolis. And once they accept, the investigators have a day, maybe a day and a half to, investigate. We get several handouts for this. Now, instead of just using library use to discover this stuff, handout 1 should just be common knowledge or maybe an education roll. Now, there is an actual newspaper article from 1854 that's in the module on page 30, so you could use that as a handout for any characters that are researching this. Now, handout 2 is a 40-year-old history, so maybe we could do a hard education or a history roll just to use that instead of just library use. Same thing with handout 3. Now, speaking of handout 3, there's a line about an oak tree, dating all the way back to 1840, which, that's only 50 years ago, so I changed that to 1340. So, a little bit more worthy of mentioning. Otherwise, a 50-year-old English oak, it's like, who cares? That's a baby English oak. So, as always, link below if you want to use any of my modified or custom handouts. Just use them and have fun. The investigators should hopefully pay a visit to the West Norwood Cemetery, see the dig site, meet some of the other NPCs here. Now, one thing that I changed when I ran this is I had Sir Edward's coffin had this lead seal on it with a sort of John Dee symbol on it, but the workers' shovels when they were digging had marred it and broken it off the rotted wood. So any investigators that went down inside the pit could find this bent and marred lead seal in the mud, and I could tip them off that there was something definitely occultic going on here. And then with a successful occult roll could identify this as something that binds the occupant to a coffin. And then on a hard occult roll, they could identify this as a seal that was personally set by John Dee himself. Old burial records can be found inside the chapel basement. The investigators can get access to all those records from Father Benjamin, who can be, bribed with a little bit of whiskey to not only let them down into the chapel basement, but also to offer his assistance on the train later on. Whoa, we could just befriend this guy by giving him booze? Padre, you and I are about to become great pals. Scouring the records allows up to 5 rolls to discover and recognize the name of Sir Edward Cockayne. Now, if keepers add the broken lead seal like I did and they recognize the John Dee relation to that, I'd have that time be halved because the investigators can now narrow the search to the time period of John Dee's life. However, the only information that the players can learn about Sir Edward is that he was a 16th century occultist, so I beef this up with a brand new handout if they research him in the library once they get a name. And even in the Hudson and Brand occult library, there should be some information about him if they look for it. I added that he was a goldsmith and had studied how to triumph over death. I also photoshopped a portrait of him featuring the gold pendant that young Barry had stolen and hidden. Again, link below for any of my custom handouts. Feel free to use them and have fun with them. Hey guys, it sounds like we might be going up against a 16th century necromancer here, and even Dr. John Dee sounded like he was worried about this guy coming back, so that gives it a bit of credibility. But more importantly than that, this guy sounds like he might be having a lot of gold on him. What? Play a characters are gonna play a character. At 6 p.m., the boxed remains from that day's digging are then moved to Waterloo Station and loaded onto the Necropolis train, which leaves for Brookwood Cemetery at 11:20 p.m. The train itself is pretty short, and we get maps for 7 of the cars. The 2 engineer NPCs will be up in the front engine area, but Tommy and his small crew and Father Benjamin, if the PCs ask him to join, will all be in the back and second-class car. I find it interesting that all of the characters, they're these kind of working-class Joes, and they're kind of spoiling themselves here by sitting all the way up in the second-class car, a little bit fancier than they'd normally experience, but none of them are willing to go all the way up into the first-class car because, even though there's no one else on this train and no one is going to know that they sat in the first-class cabin, that kind of ingrained class separation is just still kind of that hard worked in that they still won't even go sit up in the first-class cabin. Now, I'd have Tommy go ahead and just forbid his men from going into the first-class car altogether, maybe under the excuse that, all their filthy work boots would mess up the carpet and all the velvet seats. Young Barry, meanwhile, hid that amulet in first class, and it never says why he hid it in first class, so we can say that he snuck in there, maybe looking for something to steal, and Tommy or somebody came through, so young Barry, because he knew he wasn't supposed to even been there in the first place, kind of quickly stashed his ill-gotten loot before he got spotted. So now he's wanting to get to his treasure that's up in the first-class coach, but he's terrified of getting caught because, none of them are allowed inside that cabin. And maybe even a psychology check, if any of the player characters are watching him, they'll notice that he keeps kind of glancing up towards the front of the train where the first-class car is, giving the hint to them that there is definitely something up there that he is really thinking about. This little addition answers a couple of the questions that the module itself don't, such as why did young Barry hide the amulet in the first class car to begin with, and why hasn't he gone back to retrieve it in the past week since he hid it there? Yeah, it's a pretty simple answer, but that's usually the case with those unanswered questions that, players always seem to pick up on and that dwell on and complain about as making no sense. It doesn't say how long the ride takes to get to the cemetery, but I assume it'll reach the destination shortly after midnight. The 3 hearse cars each hold 12 crates, making 36 crates total. Now, these crates are not like coffins, they're just loaded with dirt and loose bones and decaying body parts. Nothing happens on the way out to the cemetery, which is kind of meant to increase the player tension, but I also see this as a really big wasted opportunity. So I would suggest that game masters choose any characters that might be off by themselves or momentarily isolated somewhere, like maybe as they're kind of moving between cars or something. Have a visit from Sir Edward's spirit. Sir Edward is gathering magic points, so maybe they can make a hard POW save, and if they fail this, they feel this kind of moment's chill or this kind of lightheadedness as they lose 1 to 2 magic points because he's draining them in order to animate a new body for himself. Arriving at the Necropolis, they meet up with a second crew who helps unloading all of these crates. We get a lot of descriptions of this place, but the only thing that happens is that at one point, young Barry believes that he hears whispering coming from a crate and he drops it, smashing it open. He's shaken by this, but the only result of the incident causes the workers to forget to unload 3 crates from the train and they accidentally leave them on board. Now, these remaining crates are meant to be the setup for the big finale, but I personally don't like this, mostly because when we ran this adventure, my players were very diligently investigating the train the entire time that they were going to be riding on it while they were at the Necropolis, so they were kind of passing back and forth through all the cars, so they definitely would have seen a trio of forgotten crates on board before they had even left the cemetery station, so they would have pointed out that they forgot 3 crates and they would have unloaded them, and that kind of would have ruined the finale because there wouldn't have been any way that he could have gotten the body parts to animate a new body. So my suggestion is as midnight approaches, just before they arrive at Brookwood Cemetery and everyone's getting nervous because that's when the creepy events start happening, have one of the racks in the hearse cars just give out and these crates of bones and dirt come crashing down and smashing into each other and just all spilling open everywhere. And it's this huge racket that everyone on board the train hears, but it only looks like a huge mess because all this dirt and body parts are just spilled everywhere. However, in the confusion of that mess, Sir Edward animates several of the individual body parts and they kind of crawl away maybe into some sort of dark corner, or maybe they crawl to the underside of the train, or maybe up on the roof, wherever it is you want, and then they start assembling themselves into the abomination later on. So, the laborers at the station, they're complaining and they're cleaning up all this disgusting mess, and they don't notice that there's, 2 bodies worth of remains that are missing from all of this stuff because it's just this big haphazard mess. Now, you could still keep the scene of young Barry dropping the crate because he had heard some of the animated pieces inside before Sir Edward kind of released his hold on them. So you could still have that scene of him dropping a crate, but we can go ahead and not leave the 3 crates aboard. We can say that Sir Edward already got everything he needed before the train arrived at the Necropolis. One of the big risks with this adventure is up until when they leave Brookwood Cemetery, nothing has really happened so far. I mean, they got on a train and they rode out here, then somebody dropped a box, but nothing supernatural was going on with that. And, the idea is that you want to kind of draw it out and increase the tension and let the players wonder when something is going to happen. However, Keepers, you're going to want to keep a good eye on your players here to make sure that you're really keeping their interest throughout this whole thing, because there can be a fine line between heightened tension and just frustrated and bored, so you don't want to draw this part out too long. The big finale reveal happens on the trip back to London, taking the pieces of rotted corpses from those forgotten crates, or, if you follow my suggestion, from the giant crash and spill of multiple crates, he forms this horrifying and totally gnarly abomination. Now, once formed, this creature begins making its way towards the front of the train. Now, the investigators and the NPCs will likely hear it as it smashes its way into the rear third-class car. Listen, you guys smell something? Guys, I think we might have picked up a stowaway. Unless stopped, it takes the abomination 28 rounds to reach the front of the train and crash the train. Now, Father Benjamin is going to throw some holy water on it, but to no effect. Old Bob has a revolver, but he only has 3 rounds of ammo to use, and he's not that great with it. Now, Tommy has the keys, which can be used to lock all the doors between wherever the creature is in the front, forcing the abomination to slow down and have to smash through all these doors one by one, and can buy the investigators just a little bit more time. Young Barry, meanwhile, is going to freak out and run screaming his apologies. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. It requires a hard intimidate to get him to confess why it is that he's sorry, and he stole and hid this amulet up in first class, though with his panicked, frightened brain, he can't recall exactly where it was that he hid it in first class, so the investigators are still going to need a search for it. And keepers, remember that young Barry's working class, so any middle class characters, they should just have a regular difficulty on this roll, and any upper class characters, it should be regular difficulty plus a bonus die in order to intimidate his sniveling ass. I also added that in addition to this amulet that young Barry had stolen and hidden, it was in this bundle of other treasures of different loot that he'd been finding. Maybe the odd piece of jewelry here and there, nothing too terribly valuable, but a lot of pennies that people had left on the eyes of the dead. Young Barry had been kind of gathering those up while he was digging, so he'd kind of thrown all of this in this kind of dirty cloth bundle that he had hidden up in first class. What happens next is completely up to the player characters. They might leap for the moving train, which certainly has its risks of serious injury. Now, if they find the amulet and they just give it to the abomination, it's going to jump off and leave. Or, they might throw it out the window or something like that, and the abomination is just going to jump after it like a dog or something. Fighting this thing is hard. It has 3 attacks that do a lot of damage, and it has a lot of hit points. And any damage that's not done to one of its 2 heads is just simply ignored. Now, targeting a head requires that the player has a penalty die, though I might add a luck roll or a hard success of accidentally hitting the head if they're attacking this thing, but they don't make a called shot for the head. Keepers should also mention how bullets or other weapons don't seem to hurt it whenever they're hitting it in the body, but then a hit to the head sends this thing reeling, and that can be a really good clue to all the players that maybe they should be aiming for the head. Now, taking a penalty die just to shoot that thing in the head, that might sound like it's a big problem, but keepers, always remember that if the player character gets itself up on it in point-blank range, that they get a bonus die to hit it, so those 2 just end up canceling themselves out. Once the monster is defeated, the adventure is done. Tommy pays them for their help, and that's that. Now, if the investigators never found the amulet, the abomination reforms after a week, and without the investigators there to stop it, this time it kills everyone aboard and crashes the train, which is probably going to cost the characters just a little bit of sanity because they're going to realize that they actually hadn't stopped the threat. Now, if they keep this amulet, Sir Edward begins haunting them. Now, destroying the amulet, such as maybe they melt it down, or maybe they hit it with an axe, or shoot it with a pistol, this is the only means of permanently stopping Sir Edward because they've, released the Horcrux or the power or whatever it is inside of it. Though I really do like the suggestion that if they give Sir Edward the amulet or, throw it off the train in something where he leaps off to retrieve it, Sir Edward, now in a much less horrifying body, might eventually approach the investigators to ask them for help with some occult problem that he's now facing. And I think that's a cool idea that this monster comes back and is all like, hey, I'd like to hire you because I need some help for something in this weird new century of the modern age. Overall, this is a pretty short and simple adventure. It's really just a single encounter, so it would work well for a convention or maybe just a one-shot game. My biggest criticisms about it are, 1, I feel that the investigation phase could have included more information about Sir Edward himself as a way that the players can learn, who he was, and, a little bit more about him being an occultist, which was the reason that I added that portion of the handouts that I did, so that's a pretty easy fix, problem solved right there. My second big concern is the part where the 3 crates get left and forgotten aboard the train, because, the investigators, they could easily spot them before they leave the cemetery, in time for them to still be unloaded. So after all, they were hired to investigate this train here and watch what's going on, so there really isn't anything preventing them from noticing these 3 crates were left aboard, and that's a pretty big point of potential failure since the big finale hinges on these 3 crates being left aboard. So I recommend that you have the gates, all the crates crash and spill shortly before the train arrives, giving Sir Edward that opportunity to animate some of the rotted body parts and scuttle away to a safe place where he can then rebuild himself unseen, and that way we don't have to worry about the player characters discovering the crates before they leave the big cemetery. Once again, that's a pretty easy fix to do. Finally, the Abomination is seriously tough. I mean, 3 attacks, a lot of hit points, and requires a called shot to even hurt this thing in the first place. It could easily rip through the party and lead to a total party kill, so Game Masters should throw some of the NPCs in its way to first demonstrate just how lethal this monster is, and also give the characters an opportunity to see that maybe if it gets hit in the head is the only way to harm it. Now maybe this will give them time to formulate a plan and go and find the amulet, either destroying the amulet or just giving it off to Sir Edward. But while the scenario does have a few problem areas, I think it's got some really good bones here, no pun intended. Don't be a coward, always intend your puns. The problem parts for this scenario are pretty easy to fix with just a little bit of Game Master prep, and then once you do, this is a really interesting scenario that incorporates some real history that, I've personally never known about any of this stuff, and it brings a terrifyingly cool monster onto a train, which is always fun to do, so I think it is more than worth it. You can find Nightmare on the Necropolis Express on DriveThruRPG, links below. If you're looking for a short Gaslight scenario that offers an interesting story and a brand new and terrifying monster, I suggest checking it out. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see some more of our stuff, such as game reviews, RPG philosophy, just hit that subscribe button. Till next time, investigators, you have a great day. I don't know what you're talking about when you say that Abomination is so tough. I mean, yeah, sure, on paper, that thing was the single toughest opponent that our Gaslight characters have faced down against by far. But in our game, 2 of the player characters, they were patrolling the train, and they were off in the back car when that thing appeared and made all that commotion, so they came running up on it from behind just in time to see old Bob emptying his revolver in it to no effect, and then that monster eviscerated old Bob down to his component pieces. So one of the player characters, taking the hint, he stepped up within point-blank range and with his big .455 Webley fired 3 shots at that thing's head, scoring 2 hits, including an impaling strike, and that beast went down like a bag of potatoes. And we're standing there going like, what? That's it? That was easy. My experience, Call of Cthulhu monsters only come in 2 forms. Either, no breaking a sweat, easy as pie pushovers, or the most impossible, you're a bad game master for even trying to throw us against this thing opponents. And keep in mind, though, the entire metric for which one is which is entirely based off of our vibes and whatever our dice are rolling that day, and nothing to do with what the monster looks like on its stats.